All right, we're live. Okay. Hi, everyone. We're starting a couple minutes late, but really excited to have Andrew Jones with me for Inner Joy. Inner Joy is a show that I host bi-weekly to dive deeper into different aspects of data management and data governance. This is hosted from Selectstar. We are a data cataloging, leading edge data governance platform. And today I have the pleasure of having Andrew Jones, who used to be a data engineer at both Cardless, now an independent consultant and author of Data Contracts book, and also I would say a really amazing data influencer uh, today. So Andrew, excited to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Great, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So just to start off, would love to just kick off with a quick intro. If you can give us a understanding of how you got to data and how you got to where you are today, it would be great to hear your story.
Yeah, sure. So I got data by accident, really. So I started off as a software engineer for a company called ARM, who design microprocessors for most famously for mobile phones, but for many devices. And I spent many years there doing various roles, but mainly I was trying to help. So when they design a processor, they run a lot of tests on it, and they run on big clusters. And I was trying to help them run more tests on the clusters so they can get more results next day to go through those results. And we started doing that really well, and the clusters got bigger and the chips got more complex. And we ended up with having a lot of this data to go through and to process. So then we started thinking we need some sort of data platform to handle all this data. And this was a few years ago. This is back when Spark had just come out, but we were using Hadoop. So a little while ago now. But essentially, I ended up becoming tech lead of a team to build that data platform from scratch at ARM. So I did that for a few years using a bit of Hadoop, then in Spark. And then I left ARM to join Go Cardless. And there I was the first data platform or data engineer hire. And again, we had no data platform and we had an objective to build one from scratch. So I got the opportunity to do that again, using all the lessons I learned and avoiding many mistakes I made first time to build a data platform from scratch at Go Cardless. And that was 7 years ago. Um, and yeah, me and the team built out the data platform since then. And yeah, like I said, more recently, I now started doing consulting. So I now help other companies as well build out their data platforms.
That's amazing. I didn't know you were the first person in the data team for Go Carlos. That's a scary position to be in. To walk into a
Yeah.
place where they don't have any like I guess data person. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great opportunity. I didn't realize the scope of the opportunity at the time. Um, there was about 80 people in Go Carlos in total. Now we're 800 people. And yeah, we had a few BI people, but we had no data platform at all. They had
Mm,
just become BI people, had just started using Airflow. We just
mm.
started moving to Google Cloud and BigQuery, but really there was nothing. So yeah, it's a great opportunity, and I've learned a lot doing it.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you kind of became or coined the term with data contracts and yeah, how you fell into that.
Yeah, so problem we had is about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we started thinking about what became data contracts. And problem we had was we had an objective in our company, a strategy to use our data through ML models to drive revenue. And our data wasn't really reliable enough or good enough quality to do that. So I started thinking about, well, how can we improve particularly reliability? That was our main problem. Data wasn't reliable enough to build revenue generating products on top of it. So I started thinking about, well, why is that the case? How can we improve that? Now it's important enough to improve it because it's part of our company strategy. So I started thinking about that. There are many potential solutions, but what I really felt was the reason I come to the root cause analysis on it, and the reason why the data wasn't of good enough quality or wasn't reliable enough is because there are changes happening upstream that happened without any warning, breaking things downstream. So like breaking schema changes, which I think is a common problem for data engineers to deal with. And same problem for us. So when I started thinking, well, why is that the case? And basically I kept asking why on these questions. And why is it the case? Well, it's because we're building on top of the upstream database directly. We had CDC in between, but basically building on top of the database directly. Same structure, same schema, just a copy of it. And I was thinking, well, why do we do that? Why do we build on top of the database directly? And I mentioned at the start, I was a software engineer, so I still got a bit of that knowledge. I was like, well, I would never do that if I was a software engineer. I'd always go through an API, an interface. So then I asked, why again? Why are we not doing that for data? And that's when I realized I couldn't really think of a good answer for that. And because I couldn't think of a good answer, a good reason why we're not doing that, I started thinking about what would the interface for data look like. And eventually that became data contracts and became the way we built data products at GoCardless.
Totally. That's a great way. I guess it makes sense because I also have a software engineering background. I used to be an engineer, and like it is a very common for application development to happen in that, like front end only interfaces the data in the back end through API. So how do you today define data contracts? And what are some of the, I guess, misconceptions that you run into about data contracts from others?
So to define data contracts, it's quite a simple idea, really. It's essentially a document, a human readable and machine readable document that codifies the agreements you've made between producers and consumers. And in that might include things like a schema. You've agreed a schema and that's documented there. It might include an owner, and it might include SLOs, might include various other things. Whatever you need to include in there, you can put in there. It basically describes the agreement you've made, sets the expectations from the producer to the consumers. It's quite a simple idea. From that, you can then create this interface I was talking about, which could be a table in a data warehouse, could be a stream in Kafka or similar, doesn't really matter. And then what you've got there is you've got this definition, this data contract, a bit like an API definition, and you've got an interface. And then when you apply change management to that definition, you're applying change management to the interface. And that's where you get, that's how you start preventing these breaking schema changes, kind of problem I spoke about a bit earlier. So that's what it is, really. Very simple idea. Describe your data, describe what agreements you've made between producers and consumers, and then use that in some form to create interfaces or to define SLOs and monitor SLOs or whatever it is you're focusing on as part of that agreement. So that's all it is for a definition. I think misconceptions is people think about, it's partly my fault, they hear the word data contracts, they start thinking about, they focus on the word contracts, and they start thinking about how can we enforce these contracts, how can we make people sign on the dotted line and things like that. And I get why we try and do that. Data engineers often, we have a bit of a hard time. We get this poor quality data, we want to try and get it improved before it gets to us. But words like enforce and signing contracts and complying to contracts, they don't really help with the more collaboration that you need between producers and consumers, this communication. They already start off from an area of friction and conflict. So I don't really like words like that. But often I'd see those kind of posts on LinkedIn or elsewhere where people are talking about enforcement and trying to use data contracts to enforce rules and enforce policies on teams who might not want those enforced on them. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception about data contracts.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I guess just on that thread, how do you recommend our audience to think about making data contracts to be more adopted and actually utilized in their teams?
Yeah, I think you really got to think about what you want your data contracts to achieve. So for us, it was about preventing breaking schema changes. And that's very common for many people I speak to. So how do you want to do that? Who do you want to be creating with contracts to achieve that? Like, who's going to be actually creating these contracts, design it for them, and how does all of this together achieve some sort of business goal? So how does it align business strategy? Because you need that. That's probably most important. From there, you can start doing, you can start incentivizing, for example, software engineers to take ownership of data contracts, and start using data contracts. But if you're just, as a data engineering team, not doing those things, if you're just trying to find data contracts without really speaking to producers, without aligning to company goals, then that's not likely to succeed. That's going to be very difficult to get through. So yeah, I think if you want to get started data contracts, focus on problem you want to solve for business and why that's important for a business. Focus on who else you need to be involved in this project. Often that, or always that will be data producers. So who are they and how are they going to be involved? How are they going to use this? How are they going to be incentivized to use this? And then together with those stakeholders and other stakeholders, come up with a plan to implement data contracts in your organization.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really spot on. In many cases, I think the schema changes that happen in the analytics pipeline, like within, like let's say DBT jobs or Airflow, or even just within just the data, like a data warehouse, data lake perspective. Now, many tools, including Select Star, supports lineage and ways to automate to understand what the downstream impact look like. So it's a little bit easier to trace the impact of changes, schema changes. But I feel like the part that happens now is with schema changes is starting to go upstream, where the source data is coming from. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So if I were to try to build the data contracts on the where data is getting ingested, well, first of all, I want to also hear your take. If you agree with my statement around like, oh, analytics is like starting to get better, or feel like data contracts also need to reside at there too, versus maybe just having those more focused on these aspects of where cross application, cross platform exchange happens on data.
Yeah, yes, I'd agree with that. I think with data contracts, you're really looking at prevention, so preventing these breaking changes from happening. So how can you make that part of your software development lifecycle or data development lifecycle to prevent, for example, breaking schema changes from being deployed into production? And having tools that have lineage, that can do impact analysis, they help people understand the impact, but only if people actually use them. So, like beforehand. They can also help us identify those issues and resolve them quicker, which is still important and still needed. You still need these downstream observability and lineage tools for sure. You're not going to get rid of every data issue with data contracts. But with data contracts, what we're trying to do is prevent many of these issues from happening in the first place, saving a lot of the costs associated with that, all the incidents you're having, all the time spent fixing those. That's not time spent delivering value for organizations. So really, it's focused on prevention rather than remediation.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point, and this is why, we've integrated our lineage into the CI pipeline so that any PR gets reviewed with the impact that it may happen. But the part where I feel like data contract really helps is not just to share the impact, but actually providing the context of what, like almost like a pre and post condition of like how the data should actually look like when it's entering, this next phase.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see it as kind of like almost like a life cycle it goes through. So you might start with a data contract in a document somewhere and using that for requirements gathering and talking to stakeholders and really understanding what they need, what you can provide, having a conversation between both producers and consumers, working out different trade-offs, things like that. Then the data contract can codify those agreements, which might be for schemas, might be SLOs, might be the support, like are they on call for it, or is it best effort during office hours? Anything else you need to record there. You then codify that in data contract, put it in as part of the development workflow, so CI/CD and things like that. and then use that as you commit to Git and you use that as a source of truth for what's been agreed. And then now future consumers come along, they can see what's been agreed, they can see what's been provided, they can make an informed decision about whether that data meets their requirements before they start using it for some sort of important process or important data application they're building. I think that's kind of a key point, really. What we found before data contracts is, in the absence of these expectations, people just assume the best based on what they've seen recently. So I might look at the data, like, over the last couple of weeks, it's been working perfectly, and it's always arrives within 10 minutes. So that's probably how it's always going to be. So I'll assume that and build my downstream application based on that assumption. But if there's no one behind the data guaranteeing that or promising that, no one on the hook for when that doesn't happen, then it's not really guaranteed. It just happens to be working well at the moment, but no guarantee of future performance. So then when things do break, you have this mismatch in expectations between those using the data, thinking it's always going to be reliable, it's always going to be within 10 minutes, and if it broke, I can pick up the phone and someone's going to fix it the same day, compared to the data producers thought, this was the best ever thing. I wasn't really, not been productionized yet. It just happened to be working well because it's been fine recently. And it's when you get mismatched expectations is when real problems, I think, start happening. It's when, you can have a real impact on whatever process or data application you're building, and it can be very hard to resolve, very expensive to resolve.
For sure. And I think related to that, we have a great question here from Sudar, sorry about mispronouncing your name. He says, from like ultimate upstream provider point of view. So this is directly from the data producers. How can I meet the data quality expectations that's coming from various downstream consumer? Because they all have their own different purposes and ways they use my data. I think it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You do have this one-to-many relationship, right? You have one producer of a data set, and if it's an important data set, which are the ones you probably want data contracts on, it can be used by many different people for many different purposes. So it's a really good question. This is why the data contract must be owned by the producer, because only they have full context of the different use cases they're trying to support. But not only that, not only have they got these requirements coming in from consumers, they've got their own limitations and trade-offs they need to make. So if a consumer is saying, I need this data within 10 minutes every day, but their architecture is set up to make it daily, and making that from daily to hourly is a huge expense. Like, there's nothing, as a consumer, you can ask for it as much as you like, but maybe it's not worth the effort of doing that. So then as a consumer, you need to make a decision whether that's good enough for you. And if it's not, maybe you have to get prioritized at kind of company level to get that work prioritized. So I think, it's a great question. You can't, as a producer, you can't just say yes to all the requirements. You have to think about what can you actually meet, how does it affect the other requirements I'm getting from other consumers, and then you have to provide the data quality expectations that you feel comfortable meeting and that you're going to be on call for, or on the hook for, and that's all you can do, really. And if you can't do better, then a business case is made for that investment to do better.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I think also this is coming from like now there is like the more need for companies to have roles like data product managers, so they can really evaluate and assess the business use cases and define what the right SLA is, should there be, for different data assets and the products that are managed for downstream consumers. But yeah, I think that's a great point. So I guess to go into it a little bit further, what are the things that should be defined in the data contracts and visible in the interfaces when somebody's like trying to put this in place?
Yeah, so I would say at the very least, a data contract would have a schema, an owner, and a version. You need the schema so you can create the interfaces and you can document what the data is going to be. Data should be owned, so you need to have an owner. If it's not owned, then who's going to be accountable for this data? And you need a version if you want to handle this change management side. So you need to be able to evolve a version and handle those changes.
Okay. That seems like a very like I feel like I'm seeing almost like a API documentation on on data products. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, and so, but a lot of the times the actual schema, I think ownership definitely is something that a lot of people need to add. But schema is also very visible from like databases that I have access to. So like, what are other things on top of that you feel like is helpful and important to add if they have, let's say, a data catalog that can scrape all of those, or within the like a comments of the code, or the interface that you feel like is kind of like next level that really helps the both the communication between producers and consumers.
Yeah, so next level really can put anything in a data contract that is useful to record alongside data, so any metadata. So it really depends on what your requirements are, what do you need to implement with data contracts. So for example, you could categorize data. Is it personal data or not? Is it related to a customer or a employee? Those kind of things. And then you start using that to automatically apply permissions, do role-based access control based on that, which is what we do. You could put in things like data retention. How long should we keep this data for? And then you could build some tooling there that performs maybe like GDPR style deletions if we need to do that. You could put even like more infrastructure style things in data contract. So what we do is they can define how long they want backups to be stored for, and then we automatically take backups for that. We build tooling around that. So really, you can put anything you like in there that can help you automate the management of data or help you give more information to consumers of data. So SLOs is a good one because that gives information to consumer. It says, okay, it's going to be updated within an hour. We're on call 24/7 for this, through this, and this is how you raise a page to us when needed. That's expectations to users, but you can also build tooling around that to automatically monitor those SLOs, to send the alerts, to raise incidents when those SLOs are breached and things like that. So that's kind of using both sides, a bit of automation and a bit of communication too. But really, there's no limit. What we found since we started doing data contracts, 6 years ago, like we come up with this idea of describing data, having an interface, but we realized that any data platform feature that we wanted to deliver as a data platform team to our users, to people who manage data or people who consume data, we can deliver through data contracts. It's been as simple as backups um, to anonymization and data retention to access controls and role-based access, like anything in between as well, we've been able to automate and define through data contracts. So really, we've built a whole data platform around this idea of data contracts, this simple idea of describing data in a machine readable format.
Yeah, actually, we got a very relevant question here from Raphael that they are implementing data contracts to document data products in a machine readable format, aiming to enable future automation. Is this an effective approach?
Yeah, so exactly what I've been talking about. Yeah, very effective. It really helps with data governance as well, particularly if you're looking at data mesh, or if not the whole data mesh, if you're looking at this idea of federated data governance. That's the way you implement that, is through something like data contracts. You have the policies set by a central data governance team or whoever owns data governance, the organization, data protection officer. They define policies, but the actual management of data is defined through data contract. So the data producers who know the data, they are the ones saying this is personal data and this relates to a customer, because no one else knows that. They know that best. It's their data. And then the policies define, say, okay, if it's personal data about a customer, we should only be keeping it for this many years, and then we should be deleting it if they are no longer active. So then they define policies, and then as a data platform team, you build the automation to perform that policy on the data as it's using the information that's been tagged on the policy that you've got from the central data governance authority, whoever it is in your company. So yeah, very effective approach.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'll add to this is like one good example around it would also be around data classification. Uh, where I've seen data classification done the best is when it was tagged, when it was classified at the collection and the retrieval of the source data. As soon as it goes into Kafka queue, this is now tagged, and you can propagate downstream all the way to where the BI dashboards may go. And to do this as upstream as possible, and so that it is machine readable and can be applied throughout other systems, I think is just like a really good approach to make things more automated and doesn't go hairy or go you say this and I say this, like the siloed yeah issues that you may come through.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
And so we have another questions on this. What are hence the recommended approach to commit the data contracts? Because I'm sure in many cases, immediate upstream systems, or like, does it only have to happen at the most source of the data?
Yeah, another great question. So if you think about it, or it has to, my answer would be you have to start with the ultimate upstream source, the data source. And the reason why I say that is if you think about it, let's say I'm somewhere in the middle of this supply chain of data, and I'm being asked to define a data contract for my consumers, and I'm being asked to guarantee certain things in a data contract, like define some SLOs or promise that my schema is not going to break without a particular migration plan. How can I promise that if the data I'm getting doesn't have the same sort of guarantees? I can't make a promise that data is going to be, 99, like 5 nines, or 5 nines is quite high, but like 99% availability if my data that I'm consuming does not have the same guarantee, same or higher guarantee. I'm just setting myself up to fail there. I can't do anything about it. If the data upstream has no expectations or expectations that are lower than that, like 90% availability, I can't easily make mine higher than that unless I've got different data sources and things like that. I can somehow move around back in behind the scenes. But that's like extremely difficult. So yeah, you really have to start with the ultimate upstream system as you've written here. Otherwise, like you're promising something you probably can't deliver.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I also think that having some SLA and the commitment on the immediate systems or in between is also important, especially if you are directly serving like some critical business use cases. And obviously, it has to come with, hey, like check out our dependencies. If I have upstream issues, then like obviously like we won't be able to meet the SLA because it's dependent on like the contracts being or everything works well on the upstream too. So having that being able to provide both of that context is also important.
Yeah, that's fair. I think what I tend to advise people to do when we're looking about where to put data contracts, I like to phrase it as you put them at the ownership, the boundaries of ownership. So whenever data is moving between one team to another, or one domain to another, or whatever it might be, one system to another, those are places you want to find data contracts. That's when it's moving between ownership. So ideally, you start at the most upstream, but then on every time it moves between owners, between systems, there should be a new data contract there defining expectations for those downstream consumers. I wouldn't necessarily put data contracts in every, if you're using DBT, for example, like every single transformation. that'd be a lot of work.
Yeah,
That's kind of your internal models. That's your internal interfaces there. You don't need to document all of those in the same level of discipline. But yeah, when you're making it available to other people, that's when you want to have a data contract.
yep. Cool. We have another question here, more about adoption from Ricardo. Very, I guess, relevant question for everyone because, depending on the maturity of an organization and each one of the departments that generate data, going straight into data contracts can feel like a very big hurdle. What's the natural evolution or set of steps that you can suggest these teams to go from basics to data contracts?
Yeah, good question. I certainly wouldn't recommend that you go try to go to day contract like overnight and have it on everywhere. That's a big migration, and that's going to take a long time. And it's probably not going to be worth the effort until for all the data sets you have in every part of a business. So I think you want to start small. You want to start with sort of POCs, proving the concept in certain places. And ideally, that might be around the most important data you've got in your company. But if you can't do that for whatever reason, then choosing a team that are producing data that they're maybe they're quite data literate, they understand the problems, they have the ability to work on it, they have the time to work on it, maybe got some personal collection there. But either way, identify some good data sets to start with that not only can you prove the concept, but you can demonstrate some value quickly. So another way to identify a good data set would be one that's changing frequently and often causing downstream issues. So maybe you've got some good data there on like, this has caused 5 issues in the last quarter. And the cost of that, if you can calculate the hours spent on resolving those issues, you can add a dollar cost to that as well, which is great to do. And then once you've got these places to do this proof of concept, you start to work with them, and you who's the people define the data contracts? Are they software engineers? Are they Salesforce admins? Maybe it's Salesforce that's a problem. Whoever it might be, start working with them to work out what the solution should look like. Really get them involved, and that really helps to make them feel part of the solution, not just being told to adopt data contracts. They're involved in it. They are giving feedback. They feel a bit of ownership over this. And then you start building out the basic tooling you need for that. And the tooling doesn't have to be complicated. So in my book, for example, there's one chapter creating a very simple data contract implementation, and it's like 25 pages, lots of diagrams and stuff. So it's not something you need to spend weeks and months on. Something you should be able to spend a few weeks on, simple tooling, that lays foundations to prove the concept of data contracts in your organization, that then hopefully delivers this value that you've been talking about. And we go from there. You do this a few more times, do a bit more value, build out the platform, and gradually make it just the default way of doing data at your company and start getting that adoption and go from there. How long that take will depend on your company, how much you've got to do, but you should see it as a journey, a transformation journey, not something to adopt quickly or overnight.
Totally. We do also have a related question about this from Roy. So related to org maturity, do you find benefits that companies pursue governance efforts iteratively via contracts or more globally with a full domain, for example?
Not entirely sure I understand the question, but so governance efforts by the data contract or globally through a full domain. I'm not sure I understand the question completely in terms of like the differences between the two. So if you're trying to improve the governance at your business, and maybe there's a reason for that. So maybe you're going to some sort of compliance, like SOC 1 compliance or whatever it might be, and you need to demonstrate that your access controls are auditable and whatever else you need to do there. So that's something that you need to ultimately do globally within your business, or at least whichever parts of business touch the areas that you're being audited on for compliance. And then the way to live that would be, if you've got data contracts for most of that data, then that'd be the best way to live that. Like I was saying earlier, it's quite easy to do that automation, do that tooling that applies the policy to data. If you haven't got data contracts in all those parts of business yet, then you have a choice there whether you want to migrate to data contracts or put have something that looks a bit like data contracts on top of those data sets, or whether you want to do that tooling twice and have more different ways of, for example, applying access controls, which you can do, but there's a lot of costs there, and it's a lot harder to be, because the cost for your audits there as well, which will be ongoing. So hopefully I kind of answer your question. Well, I wasn't sure on the question, but if you've got a follow-up, do let us know, because happy to go in more details.
Yeah, actually, what I would add here is that what you mentioned earlier about going through like more of a POC phase and pick the ones that are most meaningful to the business as a initial like a kind of test case or to case to be made to get to the next phase of rollout. is actually a really important part. Um, I think a lot of the times the effort that we make in the data platform space, whether that's about adopting a tool or improving, our infrastructure, so on and so forth, many times that like we always face this, question of like, so what's the like ROI? What's the business value? Because there's so much that data teams do, like day to day. There's like always like a pile of things that they
Hmm.
need to do. So like, why do we have to make this effort to improve like this like horizontal stuff that like right now, like when if I build this pipeline, this build this dashboard, marketing team will do this right away, right? So there's always that trade-off. And I think this part about building that success case of how implementing data contracts like reduce the downtime of a dashboard or that downtime of this like pricing model to be like much less, or on-call issues, number of on-call issues that kind of got dropped, things like that is a really meaningful efforts to have, and also allows the data team and the producers to be more aware of how valuable the data that they are managing is. So I think on both sides, like building these success cases, even at a smaller scale, and then having that to be rolled out is very important. At the same time, for something like this, and I've seen this many times because we work with so many companies that are trying to roll out data governance, right? it, this is only driven by the data engineering team because they are, also getting just like calls in the middle of the night and they don't want to be on this on call, and their managers are not worried about the obviously their team's sanity and productivity. There's just so much that you can do just within the data team. It kind of does require a little bit more buy-in on the executive side as well, to say that this is going to be very important to make our infrastructure, make our overall operation to be more stable and scalable as companies grow. And I think rather than to have it as like a mandate and like a global rollout, like everybody needs to follow this, like that's not necessarily what I'm talking about, but you still do need the support, and that actually really from high up, from top down, and that really helps to find other champions and the first places where you can like roll this out. So it becomes a more collaboration and I guess like people and processes. At the same time, it is a kind of like a necessary when you're trying to do any horizontal changes inside the company.
Yeah, exactly that. You need to, you can't just build a contract tool and just hope people will move over to it. If you haven't spoke to them in advance and kind of got their buy-in, and you need buy-in at all levels of business, and you need a different message for different parts of business and different levels of business too. If you're asking other teams to do more work, then there needs to be a reason for that to, you need to make a case for that, make a case for that to be prioritised above other work that they already have planned. So yeah, having metrics like amount of instance we have, amount of dollars as a customer team, or the impact on this downstream process that affects the other sort of risk or expenditure there, or the inability to deliver on strategic goals, trying to align it with that. It's very important to get that sort of top level buy-in. And then when it comes to individual teams, it's, we've already got the prioritizations dealt with, but then it's like, how do I make the tooling easy enough for them to use so that it's not a massive overhead for them? It's not something that's going to take them weeks. They don't have to learn all the things about data governance and GDPR and whatever else SOC 1 know. How can we hide that from them, but still allow them to take ownership and responsibility for their data? So yeah, it's really important actually. It's a lot of it is around the sort of people side and process side. But tech is the easiest part. It's the people part that's a lot harder and a lot more important.
Yep. Tech is straightforward if everybody adopts
Exactly.
it. So I guess going back a little bit more into implementation, I would love to hear a little bit more about how the maintenance of data contracts can be done effectively. The governance requirements or the data model, even just or the application of how like we how like a production systems have their data model defined, these change often. So I guess one is how do you maintain the contract so that it's the or maybe it's the same question, but more of like how do you communicate these changes that's happening on the data model? Like, if you're the producer and if you, because you mentioned producers are kind of like should own the contract, right? So as things change, like how do you communicate that to the downstream or the other owners? What is your recommendation on doing that? Uh, and what are the ways to make sure that things are actually like baked into the contract more effectively for others to consume?
Yeah, it's a good question because like the easiest way to solve the issues caused by change is to say that we can't do change anymore, and that would solve our problems, but won't be very good for business. So we don't want to do that. We're talking about managing change here, really. First thing I would say is, again, depends who's defining data contracts. Many organizations it is software engineers or product engineering. That's where a lot of our most valuable data comes from. So I'll kind of use that as the context for this conversation. But think about software engineers, how are they going to define data contracts and how they can keep them updated as their code changes? Well, probably the best way to do that would be to allow them to define data contracts next to their code, or maybe even in code, rather than, for example, going to a different system and entering it in through a web UI or something like that. So allow them to define it there, and then they can manage that data contract in the same way they manage their code using, maybe use Git, maybe they use CI checks, whatever it might be, but it's kind of within their workflow. So it's exactly where I expect it to be. So, for example, I mentioned I won't do that at GoCarless. We implement data contracts in this rather weird language called JSONet, which is like JSON with extensions. It came out of Google, and it's a configuration language thing. It's not easy to use. I wouldn't recommend anyone does this unless you're using it already. But the reason we chose to use it is because that's how our engineers define their infrastructure as code through our kind of custom infrastructure as code platform. So I define the APIs. So it's most natural for them their contracts to be next to those things. It's the same thing. It's just for data rather than for APIs or for cloud resources and infrastructure as code. So we chose deliberately to implement it in that way because that would reduce the barrier to adoption for software engineers in that case. So yeah, really focusing on like that adoption and then management, through the Git workflow that I used to. And then in terms of changes, this change is quite an interesting one to imagine changes. So we thought about the different changes that could happen. We grouped them into breaking changes and non-breaking changes. So non-breaking changes would be like adding a column that was not there before, that's optional. And that's not going to affect anyone downstream, but it might unlock some new use cases. So we want to make those, we don't want to add any friction to those. There's no reason why that has to be a difficult thing to do. So people can make a change date contract, add this new column, for example, deploy it via commit to the Git repo, and then it deploys it to the interface and job done. No central review, nothing to slow that down. For breaking changes, they do tend to have an impact on downstream applications. So you're removing, for example, you might be removing a column that was previously required, and people are using that. And if that column is no longer there, downstream applications will fail. For those, we chose to make that quite a high friction event because we want to discourage that from happening. So what we did there was prevented breaking change from happening in production to existing data contracts. And if you want to make a breaking change, you have to create a new version of a contract, have some migration to that. So definitely quite high friction. And often when I get asked about how this went, people were like, well, doesn't that, now is it too hard to change data? And is that slowing down your company? But what we found was by adding friction there, people spent more time designing their schemas, designing their data contracts, engaging with stakeholders, knowing that they would have to try and reduce the amount of times they would have to change this contract in future. And what we found is that data doesn't change that much when people start putting effort into their schemas. So take an example, I mentioned Big Go Cars for like 7 years. When I joined, it was quite early on. We were operating in one country. So if you don't know Go Cars, we're a payments company. So we're a payments company. When I joined, we were quite a small company. Since then, we've expanded into doing payments in many parts of the world. So we added different parts of the world. We've added different ways to do payments. But our core payments model hasn't changed that much. It's added some new fields like the foreign exchange rate, for example, but doesn't change that much. The core data model is meant to reach a certain level of maturity. So this idea that data has to change frequently, I would change that assumption. I would say it's more a product that it can change more frequently. But if you start putting a bit more discipline around that change, a bit more effort into designing those data products, then you can reduce the change while still meeting your organization's goals.
Hmm. Okay. Uh, no, I think it's a good point. At the same time, I do also see the cases of like, if I'm running like A/B experiments, it's coming from the product side. Like the should that change the contract? Uh, uh, like so maintaining that contract if we were to add a new definition for all contracts to follow, how do we have everybody else to also add this like new field on the definition, for example? Is that something that you've run into in the past when you were implementing their contract?
So I think, with that kind of example, people design their contracts to be flexible enough to handle things like A/B tests, especially simple ones. I think if when it comes to this, the question really is like, if I was a consumer of data, like how would I? If this data is important, then I can't just allow it to be changing all the time. Like otherwise, what I build could break the next day. So if one building is important enough, I need something stable to build on. So we need this discipline around the change management and the interface. You take an example outside of data, outside of from the APIs, because it's very similar to an API. Think about a company like Stripe, who often people hold up as a good example of an API design. And they had the same API for years. And behind the scenes, Stripe has changed all the time. They're adding new features. They're doing loads of things. But the reason why people integrate with Stripe for payments, so they're important to their business, and they can do that with confidence, is that they know that API is not going to change. And if it does change one day, there'll be some sort of migration, new version, and maybe like a year to move over to it. So it's really important for them to keep the API stable, despite the fact behind the scenes that Stripe has changed. It's changed all the time. They're always adding new features. They're probably always changing things in performance. It's the same sort of thing. You might not have to go to that level of maturity for your data products, but you should be thinking about something similar. You should have the ability to make changes to your upstream applications, to run A/B tests, to change your service, to improve performance, to scale, whatever you need to do, without having to recreate all data applications downstream, particularly ones that are important enough that if they break, that has an impact on core processes or revenue generating applications. So I think, again, we both got software engineering backgrounds, and really applying that discipline because with data these days, it's valuable enough to have that discipline applied to it.
Totally makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. I guess to bubble it up a little bit, are there other companies that stand out to you other than GoCardless that was able to successfully adopt and implement data contracts? Curious, to hear a little bit more about different examples and lessons learned from these companies.
Yeah, a few companies have written about it publicly, companies like PayPal and HelloFresh and people like that. One wrote about it this week, actually, a company called Nando's. I don't know if they have those in the US, but they're a South African-based multinational restaurant chain, quite popular here in the UK as well. And they wrote an article earlier this week about how they're using data contracts. Again, it's a really interesting article, actually, and I could provide the link to it later, but it's interesting because they spoke about how they went from this centralized model, which allowed them to deliver quickly, but it wasn't very reliable, and the schemes kept breaking, to a more decentralized model to solve those problems using ideas from data mesh and by implementing data contracts. So it's a really good article and really good implementation that, again, implemented a lot of the ideas we talked about today. So a lot of the automation, a lot of the governance, a lot of the handling change management and CI checks and things like that. So really good detail in that. And the final part of the article, which was also really good, talked about how this affected their data culture because they're changing the way they do things. And I guess some good pointers there as well. So I liked it because it was a good article about the problems, the solutions being data contracts, and then the realization that it's not just the tech, it's also the culture side. So that's a really good article. We would recommend reading that if you want to learn more about data contracts.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So I guess as we wrap up, what's in the future or what's in the store for the future of data contracts?
Yeah, there's a few things. I think an idea is going to stay around. I think it's proven valuable to enough people that and this is a very simple idea. So I think as a pattern, it's going to stay around. There's efforts to create a data contract standard, to define a standard for data contract, which I'm a bit involved in as well. It's owned by the Linux Foundation, so it's an open standard, and the project is called BITL, and it's defining the open data contract standard. Actually, this week, I think, or next week, we're going to release version 3 of that. And the idea of a standard is really interesting because what would be ideal, what we've done with data contracts and what many people do with data contracts is you end up having it in one format, the format you choose to allow your developers or whoever's creating data contracts to write them in. So in our case, it's a JSON format. And we end up converting that to many other formats to integrate with other systems. So we convert it to Protobuf to integrate with we use Google PubSub, but it could be Kafka for our streaming technology. We convert it to JSON to integrate with BigQuery and create BigQuery tables. We convert it to JSON schema to create libraries for validation within the services, within Ruby services. So we're always converting from one format to another, which isn't that hard, but it's quite low value work really on its own. So imagine if you had like a standard that you could convert it to once, and then it could be read by a data quality tool to actually perform the checks, or it could be read by a data catalog to populate that catalog. If you didn't want to do it from the metadata in the tables themselves, you want to do extra metadata from the data contract. Imagine you can have it convert it once to automatically do access controls and security-based tooling. That'd be really powerful if that existed. And this data contract standard is one way to try and drive that forward and trying to have that kind of provided once and integrate with many different tools as part of your data stack.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, data contract standards, I actually didn't realize that was in the works. I'm looking forward to checking it out. Cool. Andrew, really, sorry, I actually have a physical copy of your book. It's just next to my bed, actually. But next time I see you in person, I'm gonna get your autograph there.
Sure.
What else should we any I guess as closing thought, any other maybe a device you have for companies looking to implement data contracts, any other areas that you would recommend our audience to check it out?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so my book came out last year, and that's I'm biased, but I think that's quite a good resource for quite a lot of detail around data contracts and this automation, a lot of the stuff we talked about today. If you want maybe a bit newer to data contracts, you're looking for a bit more information, I wrote a free sort of short ebook, a white paper style book called Data Contracts 101, and that could be a good starter, and that's free. So you can get that from dc101.io, so DC for data contracts, the numbers 101.io. That could give you quite a nice overview of data contracts and problems they can solve and how they can help the organization.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to checking it out. And I will also post the comment on the video here so everyone can see it. But thank you so much for joining me today, Andrew. This was a lot of fun. I had a great, I learned a lot. So really appreciate your time here. And For those of you who are still online, if you have any other questions, please feel free to just comment on the LinkedIn thread. I host this every bi-weekly, so follow Select Stars LinkedIn page if you want to be keep posted about other amazing guests and conversations like this going forward. I would love to actually have Andrew back to talk more deeply about different aspects of data contracts. So let us know what you think. And again, Andrew, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good weekend. Bye bye.
Thanks.